Hello, my name is Emmanuel Dayer. I'm a sophomore at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm the co-network director of No Lost Generation. We are very grateful to have you all here and our amazing panelists to discuss the very important issue of refugee access to higher education. For those who don't know, No Lost Generation at the George Washington University is an Elliott School organization dedicated to raising awareness about issues of global displacement. Our organization was actually the first collegiate chapter to support the 2015 No Lost Generation initiative. Our four main pillars are education, volunteering, advocacy, and fundraising. We work to educate ourselves and our campus about refugee issues through panels, film screenings, and other events. We volunteer with local resettled populations. We advocate for refugee issues by lobbying Congress, and we fundraise an average of around $3,000 per semester. In the past year, we have increased our focus on making our own campus more accessible to refugee background students with a new proposal, the Welcoming Campus Initiative. Our proposal, among many things, involves revising admission practices to be inclusive of students whose former education institutions cannot provide formal transcripts because they have been destroyed in conflict. In addition, it outlines mentorship and scholarship programs. You can read through the full proposal by following the link on page 7 of the packet, or you can scan this QR code to find the packet virtually. With that, I will introduce our incredible moderator for today. Our very own Olivia Issa is a senior at the George Washington University studying political science and Arabic. For the past 6 years, Olivia has been engaged with refugee advocacy and resettlement work in Chicago and the Washington, D.C. area by volunteering and interning with resettlement agencies and refugee aid providers throughout both cities. Olivia is the president of No Lost Generation. She is a member of Student Voices for Refugees Steering Committee, and this past summer served as Program Infrastructure Co-Chair for the U.S. Initiative on Education Pathways for Refugee Students.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Manuel, and thank you all for being here today. Due to an unforeseen emergency, unfortunately, we had to change the format of our panel, but I'm very excited to have Dr. Farmbry and Ding here to join us today. Before we get started, I want to give a huge thank you to our co-sponsoring organizations who helped us plan today's event. You can see their logos up here. First is the Elliott School of International Affairs Alumni Relations Department, and particularly Ms. Elaine Garvey has done so much to help us put this event together. Additionally, the Leadership Ethics and Practice Initiative, or LEAP, Refugee Educational Advancement Laboratory, REAL, and the International Education Association. Thank you all for helping us put this together today. As Emmanuel said, please do scan this QR code on the screen. We will be referencing that throughout the panel, and you can find more information on our partners, on our projects, and specifically on our initiative, the Welcoming Campus Initiative, to make GW more accessible to refugee background students. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our panelists today. We have Dr. Kyle Farmbry, who is the incoming president at Guilford College, so exciting, a professor in the School of Public Affairs and Administration at Rutgers University, Newark. He's the director of University Alliance for Refugees and At-Risk Migrants. And current research interests for Dr. Farmbry include intersectoral dynamics, private and independent sector entrepreneurial development, the roles of the public, private, and nonprofit sectors in facilitating minority enterprise development, and the role of community voice in public administration. Dr. Farmbry is a 3-time GW alumnus, so exciting, and has also received Fulbright New Century Scholarship and the William Diaz Research Fellowship from the Nonprofit Academic Centers Council for his research on formation of non-governmental networks to address the South African HIV/AIDS crisis. Next, we have Ding Manyang, a senior here at the George Washington University, majoring in systems engineering. She's the co-founder of Elumisha Kakuma, an organization that aims to intensively prepare refugee students student graduates from high school in Kakuma refugee camp, which is the largest refugee camp in the world, located in Kenya, to compete for international scholarships in the US. So thank you both so much for joining us today. Thank you. And we have some questions prepared, but I also would love to open it to you all during the audience Q&A section. I want to make sure you know that this event is being recorded, so any questions you pose will be recorded. Anyone who's joining us on Zoom, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will receive them up here as well. So to get started tonight, I'd love to hear from you all. Why has each of your organizations decided that this is an important issue to work on? And this issue is refugee access to higher education.
Would you like to go first?
Sure. So Elumisha Kakuma is a Swahili word that means to educate. And Kakuma Refugee Camp, as Olivia mentioned before, is the largest refugee camp in the world. And there are really a lot of lack of resources in terms of students that are really passionate about getting education. You may be, the UNHCR may provide education opportunities, primary schools, which is equivalent of elementary school here or middle school. And there's also about 2 or 3 high schools that are located there. So you can imagine that from a population of over 250,000 refugees that are there, and more than 60% of students that are there are literally school-going kids. And so if the camp only provide about 3 high schools, then where do the rest go to school? They may finish high school, but at the end of the day, they don't have the opportunity to access higher education. And I'd like to give an example because I grew up in Kakuma refugee camp, and I saw from the way people were really excited about getting educated, but then you reach a dead end by the time you finish high school. As a refugee, you are already labeled, you have that status that you're a refugee, so everyone else will, whenever they try to come up with opportunities, you will be limited because as a refugee, you are somebody that is stateless and who wants to take you out of the camp and take you to other parts to go to school. And so this is the entire reason why Elumisha Kakuma was formed, because being in a refugee camp also put that extra layer that you excluded from the rest of the world. You don't really have a lot of information about what colleges are outside the camp, what other opportunities can a student access to that. So with some of my friends who we went to a similar program, it's called Bridge to Rwanda, which took us from Kakuma refugee camp, and we went to Kigali in Rwanda, spent about 2 years doing preparation. So after sitting down, we did not want to be the only 3 students that left the camp and everyone else do not have an opportunity. So we decided to come up with a similar program using what we learned from the program that we had gone through. And so that's how Elumisha Kakuma was born. And it mainly focuses on 3 things. And first thing is intensively prepare students for opportunities, like intensively prepare them for English training, because we do not want them to, if they get an opportunity to come here to the US or even Canada, we don't want them to reach at a point where they are limited in terms of the reading or writing. So we prepare them to be ready so that when they come to college, they will be at that level. The other aspect is that as a refugee, you are also a person. You don't want to be limited to your to the status or the level of being a refugee. You are somebody that has a lot of potential, and you can bring it to the campuses where you go to. And so the bigger aspect is the community service, which mainly works on helping students to realize what is it that they have in their community, and then out of that, use those opportunities. And then after they have been prepared for that, they can now apply to colleges, and it will help them to easily integrate or assimilate into the universities or the cultures that they go into. So it's a lot of information that I've given out, but to answer, it's mainly to help students know what opportunities are out there and to prepare them to apply for scholarship and being treated at the same level as every other student that want to access higher education.
Thank you so much, Dang. That was a fantastic answer. Thank you. Dr. Farnbury.
So, Olivia, as I think about my answer to the question, I want to perhaps give you a little bit of background to illustrate how I get to the answer. And the first bit of background probably ties more into some of the interests that I've had over the years related to issues of refugees and migration. And Olivia mentioned in her introduction that, that 30 some odd years ago, I was a student here at the George Washington University. And in the fall of 1988, I went to interview for what became, was initially going to be a first semester internship during my first year at GW. And it became actually a multi-year internship at an organization then known as the United States Committee for Refugees, the global refugee advocacy organization. And I remember when I first went for my interview, my boss, a fellow by the name of Roger Winter, who was a big sort of refugee advocate back in the 80s and the 90s, sat down with me and he asked me all the sort of interview questions. And then he asked me a question that I've been reflecting on really a lot since that point in time. And his question was basically, why exactly do you think people leave? And I think anyone who's involved in refugee-related work sometimes needs to come back to that question. You know, when you think about the folks who will cross over miles upon miles of very hostile territory, when people will hop into little rubber, inflatable rafts and try to go across an ocean, knowing that in a lot of cases their boats might not make it to their ultimate destiny. You've got to really sort of reflect on these questions of why exactly would people take those risks and leave, and then you have to think about issues of resilience. You've got to think about issues of determination, and then if you think about the fact that there are millions of people who are in different situations where they are in a quasi state of resettlement or they are living in a camp, and then such a small fraction of these people have access to to different levels of education. You just mentioned in Kakuma 3 high schools for a population of 250,000 people, and to think about the fraction of the folks who then ultimately make it to colleges or universities. I often think about the untapped human potential when you don't create those educational opportunities. And the fact that right now, a large percentage of the global population has access to higher education. However, when you look at the percentage of refugees who have access to higher education, it's at about 2.5% to 3%. And if you think about the percentage of people who would love to get to a college or a university or to some sort of a higher education institution, and all of the possibilities if there were those additional opportunities for training, for finding ways of integrating people more into the economic and the social and the civic fabric that often comes with higher education, there's a lot of missed opportunities. So I think that for people who are involved in higher education institutions, and I wear, I guess, a few different hats in higher ed, and many of my colleagues who are involved in higher education, there have to be constant questions about access. And for refugee populations, that's sort of one of the key populations, I think, where we need to spend a lot of time thinking about how do we create access opportunities for higher ed.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Farnbury. You wear so many hats in the higher education space, so it's fantastic to hear your perspective on that as such. We may, in a minute here, have another panelist joining us. We can let that happen at its own pace if possible. But next, I would love to hear from both of you, given your research and experience in these topics, what are the current pathways or visas, or just general pathways, that refugees seeking higher education can access?
Do Do I go first?
I can go first.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, yeah. So I haven't done a lot of research on that, so I want to mention that whatever that I'll be talking is from my own experience, and also from what we're trying right now, because as an organization, we are pretty new. And in terms of what pathway that students, at least refugee students, can get, at least to come to the US, one thing is the easiest and the quickest way is for a student to get F1 visa. And in order to get F1 visa, it means that you should have a passport. And having a passport means that you should belong to a specific country. And so a refugee, when you are living in the camp or you are under UNHCR, it means that the legal documentation that you'll be having, they're provided by the United Nations. And so being a refugee and trying to access getting a visa to come to the US, it's really challenging, unless if you decide to travel back to your country and get a visa in order to come here. And which is really, it's really dangerous, because as a refugee, you ran away from your country. But now, because you got an opportunity to come for higher education, you are put in a really difficult situation to make a decision that it's either you miss this one-time opportunity, or you decide to go back, get that passport, and get a visa, which will make it easier. Another way is UNHCR can be really supportive, because with Elumisha Kakuma right now, we are really working with them, UNHCR Kenya. And as long as our students get into school, they have full financial aid and they can provide it at the UN embassies. Then the UNHCR can provide a document called CTD, which is, I can't really spell it out, but it's a document that legalizes the student, that the UNHCR has proved that this student has all the documents that are needed. And if there is some sort of like, if maybe there's a gap that the embassy sees, then they can reject or accept. So sometimes there's a lot of uncertainties having that, because also with the US fearing that there are a lot of like refugees coming here and they're not going to leave the country, then it means that they are more strict on them. But like having F1 visa kind of like simplifies the process, and again, it's dangerous. So you can see, at least from having those two documentation is the only possible way to come here, which is, again, it's not like the best way, but as a refugee, you are always fighting for that education, regardless. You can even means jumping into a fire in order to get that opportunity, then you rather go back to your country, get that passport, which is the same thing I did, get a passport, get my visa, come to the US and get an education. So you may have a lot of knowledge about that in terms of research. So
I was going to say F1 visa, which you
Yeah.
pointed out, and one of the other challenges with an F1 visa is that when you're going through that interview process to get that visa, often the interviewing officer is wanting to get a sense that you're coming to study, period. And that you're not really looking at a way of returning back to, or you're not looking at a way of sort of staying in the US.
Yeah.
So as you pointed out, for many, most refugees, they have left their countries for some very specific reasons. Mm-hmm. And the desire is often not that strong to go back to their home countries until things change. So just sort of the premise that the F1 sort of works under provides some real barriers or some real challenges that, in this broader dialogue, we're hoping to find some ways of navigating.
Yeah. Hi, Rosie.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. I'm so glad you could join us tonight.
Likewise.
Rosie Hughes is a refugee education pathways expert at the UN Refugee Agency, or the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, office in Washington, D.C. Rosie has worked for humanitarian aid organizations, including UNHCR, in multiple countries across Asia and Africa, and as a journalist in France and her home state of Maine. More recently, she has taught writing and storytelling to refugee students in the US and received a master's degree from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Rosie, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Sorry to be late.
It's okay. We were just speaking about, let me pull up our most recent question, what the current pathways or visas that refugees seeking higher education can access. And I know, Dr. Farnbury, you'd started. Is there anything you'd like to
No,
add?
I mean, the challenges of an F1 visa and trying to broaden some different opportunities.
Yeah. So we can maybe start on a new question. That sounds okay? Okay. So our next question, what are some of the other main barriers that refugees face in accessing U.S. higher education once they get to the States? So say everything with the F1 process happened. Once they're here in the U.S., are there challenges specific to refugee background students, and how, what do those look like, and how might those be addressed on campuses?
So in my current role at Rutgers University, Newark, I work with a number of graduate students who are refugees. And I've noticed some very similar challenges. I mean, one of the challenges is that when you're in undergraduate or graduate school, you have moments where you're just going through the cycles of being a student. And there are moments when it's just tough. And you're trying to figure out, how am I going to pay rent and eat and pay for the other costs of going to school? There are the emotional cycles. There are all sorts of moments that I know when I was in graduate school or undergrad, I would call family or friends or sort of people who are part of a safety net that I would often fall back upon at moments of just of need. And for some of my students who are coming from backgrounds where they're refugees, they don't always have that sort of social safety net that's there. So being able to scramble in a lot of cases and to build some of the support that's needed, I think is one of the things and one of the areas that's often overlooked when one's thinking about building some of these different pathways. And for people who are working with these students, the teachers, the friends and mentors, I think that there's an extra layer of understanding that one needs to bring into those relationships. Your student who is a refugee student from Iraq or Afghanistan, may not have the same type of support as your student from Maryland or New Jersey. So just understanding that is kind of a base point.
Sure. I'll just say up front, I'm still landing a little bit rattled from what happened earlier, but really glad to be here. I cringe a little bit hearing my bio because I did not choose my title and the word expert is in it. I think that Ding is much more of an expert than I am, being a student from a refugee background who came to the US on an F1 visa. This is your background, right? Yeah, so I would turn to Ding. I can say a few remarks, but from the experience that I have in working with UNHCR and our interest in this area, Olivia posed the question about what additional barriers. The legal barriers are giant, which you've already touched on, I understand. But while a student is still overseas and before they make it to the US, there are other challenges, and one of the big ones that we see is, and it varies across context, but lack of kind of support through the application process. Here in the US and also at many international schools, students will have built-in college counselors or just someone to support them through this really complicated process of applying for schools and financial aid. And in many refugee contexts, there just isn't that infrastructure to support students. So the students who end up making it to the US really, well, are incredibly remarkable and have often done so either on their own or sometimes with support from a relative who might already be in the US. But just the kind of support navigating application and financial aid process is immense. And along with that, and this is maybe an obvious point, but the there isn't a lot in the way of financial support for refugee students coming to the US to study higher ed. There are a couple of scholarships specifically for displaced students. Notably, Columbia has the largest program, and there are a couple of other smaller ones. But apart from that, there really aren't other fully funded scholarships. And even when there are, even for example at Columbia's, they don't cover things like some of the visa fees, which maybe to us sound not astronomical, $30 here, $70 here, $130 here, but can be deal breakers for a lot of students. And so the financial aspect, I think, is a big one. And there are really a part outside of scholarships that are specifically for refugee students. There are really very few other scholarships for international students, and they're highly competitive. So I think that's another really large barrier that we see. Yeah, I would turn it to saying anything to add.
I feel like you already covered a lot, like, the biggest aspect, which is really about financial needs for refugees, because these are students that they solely depend on the UNHCR. And UNHCR can only provide food or the basic necessities that can be found in the camp. And so for a student to apply to colleges here, it means that if a school is indeed really accepting to invest in the education, then all the unforeseen costs has also to be covered. You just mentioned about the visas and also some transportation, because there are no embassies in the refugee camps, and so it means that you will have to do some traveling to go to maybe the capital city of that specific country. For instance, capital city of Kenya, you have to travel to Nairobi. So you will need that cost of transportation, and at the same time, you will also need somewhere to go and sleep.
And permission to travel.
Exactly, because like as a refugee too, you are not allowed to travel outside the camp, because the temporary places, they were created for them to live there. If I may just take a little bit, just backtrack a little bit, Kakuma Refugee Camp was formed in 1992, and this was for like the over 10,000 lost boys of Sudan that had lost all their parents when the war was going on. So they trekked down from Sudan going to Ethiopia. Then when they arrived in Ethiopia, there was also another civil war that occurred there, so they had to travel back to South, and then they traveled until they came to Kenya. And so that place was created for them to be temporarily there, waiting with the hope of getting resettled, maybe to the US, Canada, Australia, or any other developed country, or even developing countries that will be more welcoming for them. But some of the families that went there in 1992, generation after generation, not only generation after generation, but they are still there. They didn't get the chances to be resettled. So meaning that the children that were born there, then they only know the camp. So there will be no relative that are going to chip in and provide that transportation cost for you or to pay for your visa. And even after you get a scholarship and the university does not also put into consideration transportation, you need to fly from whichever country you are in. So if they don't get the flight ticket for you to come here, then also raising those funds for you to come, it's also a challenge. And if you don't meet that and you don't travel to the US or any other country where your school will be, then definitely you're not gonna get started at the university that you are allowed in. Another challenge that I will say it's in terms of, these are children that ran away from, the only thing that they have known since they were born, it's war, always running away. They have been constantly running. And so they have a lot of traumatic experiences. And if they come to schools or colleges here and people don't really sit down to understand the background of these children, then it's really like a huge challenge for them to even integrate into the university or to try to learn. So if the mental health aspect of it is not taken care, for them specifically, the refugee student, they will not understand that there's something, they wouldn't understand, like, the aspect of mental health, because it's something that they have known. Everyone else that was living around them went through the similar experiences, so it's not something that is challenging. But when you come here and you kind of see the differences in terms of like the classmates or even the schools, and you have the added stress, you want to talk to somebody, but nobody really understands what you're trying to say, then it set them at, it doesn't like, put them in a position where that they can easily be successful. So apart from financial, a lot of other issues, especially the mental health aspect, and I feel like people don't really talk a lot about it for refugee students. It's something that should, it's also like a huge challenge that they go through when they come here. So those are like the few things that I can think about, but then there are so many challenges, and that's why, like, setting up even to give that scholarship to students or giving them that financial support by universities, they should also see other unforeseen challenges that they will be experiencing when they come to colleges. Yeah.
Can I add one thing also in terms of the sort of the funding piece? We talked about grants and scholarships, a default position that many U.S. students have are loans. And the access to federal loans, or in some cases private loans that, again, most refugee students don't have access to. So that adds, another, sliver to the complexity around making this happen. And I think also the value to efforts such as the ones that you're launching for this scholarship drive.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you all, and Ding especially, thank you for sharing more personal information. I appreciate all of this. Has been fantastic insight. Thank you all. So given the challenges that we've discussed, the title of our panel tonight is the Initiative on U.S. Education Pathways for Refugee Students. What is this initiative and how does it seek to address some of these challenges? That is a very broad question, but maybe to start, some of the social barrier challenges, financial barrier challenges, and legal barrier challenges maybe can be our big categories if we want to talk about that. And I'll mainly direct that to Dr. Farmbry and Rosie, but Ding as well, feel free to share your insight.
I actually struggled a little bit with the title of this event because the initiative. Yeah. And I think that there are actually a number of initiatives that are sort of now coming together under one. There are a lot of, there have been just a number of really tremendous advocates and champions for trying to find ways of building educational pathway opportunities for refugees, and one of the organizations I'm with is called the University Alliance for Refugees and At-Risk Migrants. So refugees and at-risk migrants, and trying to create more opportunities. There's the efforts that have been taking place here at GW with No Lost Generation. There have been a number of scholarship initiatives at universities and colleges. The college that I'll be joining, Guilford College in North Carolina, has an initiative called Every Campus a Refuge, where they've taken some unused space on campus and they basically create and provide housing for refugee families. So there have been a number of initiatives that have taken place. And I think that over the past probably 2 years, a number of people have been coming together and have been trying to look at ways that we could collaborate in advocating for sort of a unified effort. And the timing with the new administration that came in January, which then turned around some of the policies of the previous administration related to refugee admissions and some of the pathways, created some opportunities. So really over the past few months, a number of people who've been involved with some of these different discussions have come together, and we have put together some plans and programs that we're looking forward to seeing launched to try to galvanize some of the different channels and platforms. So I know Rosie's been at the front line of a lot of that.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a few words on the. I think the title maybe comes from the latest kind of initiative that, and I wish Miriam was here to speak to this. The President's Alliance, which isn't represented here now, but they've been kind of leading that effort of bringing people together to now propose some kind of concrete recommendations to address some of these barriers, and the kind of, so we're collectively writing a report that's going to come out on a week from tomorrow. I encourage you to all check it out. We'll be sharing it. But kind of the biggest takeaway for me from the recommendations that we're making would address the legal barrier piece. I wasn't here when you all spoke to the challenges, some of the challenges with the F1 visa, but I assume that you got into that some. But right now, the only way for refugee students to be able to come to the US for studies is through the F1 visa, which, as you probably already said, poses some kind of inherent challenges for refugee students. Has this already kind of, I mean, so, okay, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but, and mainly the temporary nature of this visa is challenging for refugee students, and the fact that to get this visa, you need to demonstrate in the interview with the consular officer that you have an intent to return home. And in many cases, and we hear about these, a number of, dozens of cases anecdotally, but also it's been documented more systematically that consular officers will automatically reject refugee students for an F1 visa because either they see that they have a document that's not a national passport, it's called a convention travel document, which is like a refugee passport, and it's not widely known among consular officers, and so they'll see this and say, oh, you don't even have a real passport.
That's the CTD, right?
The CTD.
I was struggling
You were
to
talking
define
about
it.
this. Yeah, CTD is like, it's issued either by UNHCR or a state, and it's not well known in embassies. And so there are plenty of instances where consular officers will see this and say, okay, you're clearly not in, you clearly are intending to stay in the US because you don't even have a home to go back to, so I'm going to deny you. When in fact, it is a valid travel document, and refugees are not inherently barred from accessing F1 student visas, and plenty of students do get it. But so anyway, given all of the legal challenges with the F1 student visa and the fact that it doesn't provide a durable kind of solution to people's lives, what we're proposing in this upcoming report and through this work we've been doing together is for the administration to enable US colleges and universities to what we call sponsor refugee students overseas, and allow those refugees to be able to come to the US through the Refugee Resettlement Program, which offers a pathway to permanent residency. And this is under the auspices of, for those of you who are following kind of what the administration is doing around refugee resettlement, they've announced that next year they plan to pilot a private sponsorship program through the Refugee Resettlement Program. And we're saying, hey, you should consider including US colleges and universities in this pilot program so that colleges and universities can name refugee students overseas that they wish to accept so that those students can come and then stay. And this is something that the administration has the power to do on its own through administrative procedures. And so that's kind of the top line, kind of the way that we're aiming to address this major legal barrier through the initiative. Yeah.
So if I may add, the initiative on US education pathways. I know we are all in DC, and this is where a lot of, should I call it demonstrations, do happen every now and then. And this is where you kind of like really try to influence, like, the policies that are made in Washington, DC that kind of influence either what is implemented around the nation or even around the world. And so in terms of what you can do as a person is that there are a lot of things you can do to help the refugees. It doesn't have to be getting someone from the refugee camp and bringing them here, but it's all about maybe talking to your neighbor or even your parents or even the schools, talking to them to understand why forming policies that are more welcoming for refugee students are really helpful for them. Another aspect is we do have this program like Elumisha Kakuma. Elumisha Kakuma, it's more of like providing opportunities or at least access to knowledge. We are not 100% sure that the students that we take are going to get into schools or like the schools will be willing to fully sponsor them. But at least when the students are together for that maybe a year or 6 months that they are together, they are able to do like, to interact together and also learn from different people that come to the classroom to talk to them about what is outside there. So you can volunteer at such organization, input in terms of maybe be a tourer, help in terms of like fundraising for that organization, or even volunteer at local organizations that are here to help the refugees. So those are all of them when everyone kind of like, join hand to work on something that will help make positive changes for like the refugees. This is one way of demonstrating to higher education, to schools, or even to the State Department, or even to Congress to understand why including this initiative or like including to help refugee students, it will be helpful for them. Because you will not be only changing a life of one person. I like to use an example my friend always says is that when you look at a refugee student, you are not looking at an individual. You are looking like generation that are to come after them, or those that are already behind them. So if you plug that one person, give them an opportunity to be fully educated, then you are not only improving their life, you are improving their families, and then the relatives and the entire refugee compound that they come from. And only doing that will be...
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I think Ding is being very humble here. Something that's really important in what, for me, and I think UNHCR's message kind of globally around this is, yes, it's helping that individual refugee and their family. That's important. It's also incredibly helpful to, the fact that you're here at George Washington University is only a win for George Washington University, and having your perspective here makes this place better. And we, the campus here is also gaining immensely from you and other students from similar backgrounds to be here. And I think the narrative around refugees is often, especially when we talk about refugee resettlement, it's often talking about the need to help and resettle kind of the most vulnerable and the very needy. And here, what we're saying is, yes, that's important, but also refugees have a lot to offer. They're not just vulnerable and in need. They have immense potential and skills and resilience, and that are really, as I think I heard Kyle mention, really under access is an issue. Only 5% of refugees globally have access to US higher education, compared to almost 40% for the non-refugee population. That's a huge number of people with exceptional talent that aren't having access to ways to be able to really use their talent to benefit themselves and their families, but also the societies in which they live. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely agree, and thank you so much, again, all of you, but Rosie, that really struck a chord with me, talking about how much we all benefit from programs like this. And so in a similar vein, I'd love to hear from you all any thoughts you might have on the way we here at GW can embrace this and be more inclusive of refugee background students. As you mentioned, Rosie, we are all benefiting from Ding and from everyone's experience that exists here on campus, and so this is a something clearly I'm very passionate about, and I'd love to hear your takes. Yeah.
So I remember a few months ago when you emailed me about the idea for the scholarship program that you know, the Lost Generation is launching, and I found myself then, and I find myself now, very excited about the idea of a student-driven scholarship here at GW that's being developed with the goal of creating educational opportunities for refugee students. And I say that as someone who's working in the refugee space, and as an alum of the institution, and as someone who has a number of very, very close friends who've come from very different backgrounds, who've lived the refugee experience. So I think, you know, the first thing is more work like that, and getting as many people as possible involved with that particular initiative. The other thing I would say is here at GW, there's an amazing microcosm of both the US and of the world. And I think about some of my closest friends who I met here who were from all corners of the world and from a whole range of experiences. And then what it was like going back for different people to their hometowns and talking with people who may not have had the experience of you know, all of the cultures and all of the experiences that are here. And as much as you can sort of promote this notion of the value add that that members of refugee communities bring to sort of a broader educational space here into a lot of your home communities, I think that's going to be tremendously valuable. And I say that partially because, you know, one of the things that's driving me right now in a lot of this work is a lot of concern around you know, levels of xenophobia in many communities across the country and many communities around the world. And there's a counter narrative that I think it's really important for us to build of the positive impact, and not this notion of refugees or people who are from other places who might look different being a drain on communities. And it's really, I think, through kind of the created experience, through this type of work that you can develop those messages and take them back to people who may need to hear them.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think similar program you just talked about, what No Lost Generation is really trying to at least let GW sign it. It's something that I think is really important. If it's signed and becoming part of the university policies, to at least be welcoming to refugee students will be really important. And thank you for correcting that. Yes, you mentioned that refugees are not just recipients, and that's really something that is really important to know. Like, don't just look maybe at somebody. And when I talk about myself, I'm not talking about me. I'm just talking an I that represent other refugee students, or generally, like, you know, the refugees that are seeking higher education. And so they have a lot of potential that they can bring to college campuses, or generally to the US. And so I think it's really important that GW takes part in it and just become welcoming to them.
Yeah, I would echo what both of you have said. If you're a student and you're not involved in No Lost Generation, I would get involved if I was a student. Seems like fabulous work that you all are doing. And I guess I would also just plug the report that I mentioned that's coming out a week from tomorrow. We'll make sure that all those who have attended, whose emails we have, receive it. There's going to be not only a report coming out, but kind of a campaign that we're trying to launch around this, and there will be ways to get involved, sign-ups for you know, if you're interested in being involved. So would love any and all to get involved in that as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you all for plugging No Lost Generation there. I did not pay them, I promise. If you are interested in reading through our full proposal to the GW administration, we have more information on page 6 of that packet that you can scan the QR code up here. It'll also go out in an email to everyone who's attended. We have, again, your emails, and I'll also include next week the initiative information. We have a newsletter as well for No Lost Generation. There will be more information there too. So now I think it's time we can open to audience questions. I'll start with questions from the chat, but start ruminating. Our mic runners can grab mics in the back. They'll be coming around with handheld microphones. Please keep your masks on during this time. Raise your hands if you have questions, and they'll come bring you the microphone. But to start, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any names, these are from the chat. Let's see. This is an anonymous question summarized. How do we support refugees who have been resettled to the US? Are there ways to help them get into higher education because they also face challenges of student loans and job access barriers? Thank you.
So I think there are, for those who are already resettled in the U.S., there are all sorts of means of supporting their pathway into higher education institutions, coaching them through if they're in high school or about to go to high school, the value of some courses versus others, starting to think about some of the, fun forms that you've got to fill out, such as a FAFSA form and all the other pieces of the application process. In a lot of cases, just sort of providing some of that support that that many people in school had as they were looking at different schools. I mean, keeping in mind that in many cases you're talking about first-generation students who may or may not have had a parent or a sibling who sort of has gone through the college process. So just, I think, providing a lot of that type of support is critical. And then just, providing the mentoring that gets all of us through the college experience, or got all of us through the college experience. I can, certainly think about the folks who were a year or two ahead of me who had the critical conversations that I needed, that helped me to focus when I needed to. And I think all students need that, and again, students who may not have those networks in particular might need some of that type of support.
Absolutely.
I think one thing that just come to my mind is, as long as if you know that there are refugees maybe that are living in the state or the area that you are in, helping them in understanding what option they have. Because if you graduate high school and you're looking at maybe the best way to go to college, and you can't afford maybe going to straight into a 4-year college, then is there an option they can do community college and then afterward transition into other education system? So I think really helping them to understand what option they have and what they can afford, it will be really helpful to them. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would echo what you both said. I'll use this question as an opportunity to just, I don't work, and UNHCR doesn't work on this issue for refugees who have already been resettled in this country, not because it's not really important, but because as an organization kind of globally, our interest in supporting refugee access to higher ed in this country is twofold. It's one, that kind of access gap that we mentioned before and kind of increasing access to higher ed, but two, and equally importantly, is as a kind of way to create more opportunities for more refugees to reach places of safety. And so for that reason, we're focused on refugees who are overseas, and what can we do to make sure more refugees who are overseas can come to the US outside of refugee resettlement, which may have been mentioned earlier, is really, really narrow. I think Ding mentioned that there are people who have been in Kakuma camp, for example, for years and years and years waiting on resettlement, but fewer than 1% of refugees globally get resettled. And so we're saying with partners, that number is too low. And as we've seen in this country, resettlement programs are also very politically vulnerable. So what can we do to support additional pathways to mobility and safety, and education and higher education is one of those avenues.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. And another just quick plug for No Lost Generation. If you are interested in mentoring students who are already here in the US with refugee status or refugee background through the college application process, we have an in-house volunteering program run by Uzma Rentia. Hopefully she's around here somewhere. So called New Horizons. We pair GW students with local high schoolers of refugee background. So you can, again, check that out in our form using the QR code. Sign up for our newsletter. You'll get some information about that. We're hoping to match people in the coming weeks. We have more questions from the chat. Do we want to take an audience question? I see one up here. Is that Abiel? Hey, how are you? Thank you.
Hi, yes. Question for Ding specifically. I read a few months ago that the Kenyan government is planning to shut down the Kakuma refugee camp. What's the status of that situation, and how does that impact the refugees, and in turn, what you are trying to make happen with your organization?
That's actually a really great question. Yes, so I feel like it's been something that has been on and off, where the Kenyan government has been trying to shut down Kakuma refugee camp, but again, the human rights activists have been in communication with them, because these are people that they have lived there for like almost 3 decades, and now closing the refugee camp, then where do they go? So there is still, I won't say that at this point, I don't know what the decision is, but at least there's a lot of conversation going on in terms of you can't just shut people's home down if you don't have any alternative plans on where you will take them. I don't know, was there a second part of the question that I missed? Or was it?
How would the shutdown impact your efforts?
Oh, yeah. So again, it's something that we are also trying to really navigate what that means for Elumisha Kakuma, because it's something that is running right now on the ground in Kakuma refugee camp. And if the camp were to be shut down, again, where will this student go? So we're also trying to navigate how that will look like.
Yeah. I can just add to, I don't work in Kenya, but I have plenty of colleagues who do. And I think, as Ding mentioned, they've threatened that the Kenyan government has threatened this before, and this time seems not too different. It's probably used as kind of a political bargaining chip, knowing that they're not actually going to shut it down, but they're trying to get something out of it. And I remember when that was kind of announced a couple of months ago, and from the outside, I kind of raised my alarm, and then it was interesting that colleagues in Kenya actually weren't that alarmed about it, because no, it's not actually going to be shut down. It's just kind of a political game. Hopefully.
Thank you.
So.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Thank you for that question. We'll move back to the chat now. Again, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, but a question from Samhar Okbazian. One of the major problems of refugee students is getting their credentials from their home countries, especially if they left for political reasons, and the institutions they attended are owned or run by the home government. This becomes a problem when they seek admissions or scholarship, and for some with professional degrees, they can't complete or apply for jobs or professional opportunities overseas. What do you think U.S. universities and colleges can do to assist refugees who have this particular problem? And how does this fit with the internationalization trend in U.S. higher education? It's a great question. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's a really great question, because let's say if you finish your primary school in in your home country, and then maybe war broke out or other reasons that made you to flee your country, then that means that you will not have access to your previous education documents. So I think what U.S. At least institution, the universities will be more of like to understand the context of who the student that is applying is. At least how we do it with Elumisha Kakuma is to first of all provide a written documentation to provide a general context what Kakuma Refugee Camp is before even going into who the student are. And for the schools to have that context, I think I think it will help in terms of like trying to even retrieve those documents. Obviously they cannot travel back to their countries, and if they try to get those documents and they don't have access to them, then I don't think it should be a reason why a student will be barred or will be rejected or be denied the chance to come to college, because it's not their fault. And so having that context and understanding where the student is coming from and what may have caused them to lack those documentation, I think it's really important. I don't have a perfect answer, but like in terms of that, I think just giving context to schools and school at least be willing to listen, it's something that really important. Yeah.
Absolutely.
It's also an article, it's an issue that I think organizations are talking about and trying to find some creative solutions. So at university levels, admissions officers are now aware of exactly that challenge. And I think that there are an increasing number who are trying to find some creative solutions. And then there are also some really interesting initiatives. So, Article 26 Backpack, which is an effort that Keith Watnow, who's at the University of California, Davis, has been spearheading, is an effort to basically help to digitize a number of transcripts, and they've been doing some phenomenal work in terms of dealing with these transcript services and the challenges. World Education Services has also been doing, or WES is the acronym, they've been doing quite a bit in terms of thinking about some creative ways to deal with the transcript challenges. So it's an issue that people are talking about. There is no one easy solution, but I think that there's some ones that are being developed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, important question. I'll just echo what you both said.
Yeah, I think just to add briefly onto that, I know there's increasing academic scholarship around this. I know a professor here at GW in the Graduate School of International Education, Dr. Bernard Streitwieser, has done a fair amount of research on this and has some publications related to this. I also have, there's a lot of links in links, but in this packet, we have the Welcoming Campus Initiative scholarship proposal. It also outlines how we could make our admissions practices at GW more inclusive of refugee background students. In that document, there's a whole list of resources of academic work we've cited showing alternatives to official transcripts that could be used. So there is growing academic work on this. That was a great question. Now for audience questions, we have Jessica, Christina. I love that I'm seeing so many faces. Do we want to do over here first? Right here. And then we'll move Jessica, Christina. Okay, go ahead.
Are there any tangible benefits that you've noticed in the last year since the election of the Biden administration in terms of how this issue has evolved? And is there much more that the government could be doing on a national policy level that you guys think could improve that?
Great question. Fantastic question.
I can I go ahead? You want to go?
Sure.
I would say there's not much thus far beyond talk and some kind of stated interest in this issue that the administration has done. But as I kind of alluded to before, this report, again, that's coming out next week, outlines some things that we think that they should do and that they can do. And those include, as I mentioned, creating a mechanism whereby U.S. colleges and universities, perhaps acting through a kind of like a bridge organization, would be able to basically nominate or identify refugees overseas to then be able to come through the resettlement program. That's one thing. And there are also a number of both ranging from small and large things that the government could do to make the F1 student visa process more accessible to refugee students, including, and this is relevant for Afghan students right now. I think there have been efforts to kind of particularly push on this for Afghan students, but we're asking for the administration to do this for all refugee students, that when deciding whether or not a student can get an F1 visa, the consular officer needs to say that they're reasonably likely to return home after studies, to return to where they live, and we're saying that the government should apply a standard of saying, once the conflict ends in a person's home country, that they will be reasonably likely to return home. Things like that. There's a number of kind of things that the administration could do tomorrow through cables and changes in the way that the consular officers are trained that would make the F1 student visa more accessible.
Thank you.
I think that there's and this is not going to sound as tangible as I know many people who are working in this field would like, because I think that ideally we'd like to be able to turn around and say there are these new policies that are in place, and we have created mechanisms to create these pathways. But I think that it's important to realize and to think about where 2 years ago the refugee resettlement, the refugee education, the refugee advocacy community was as a whole. And if you want to take the resettlement space by itself, the resettlement infrastructure, under the previous administration was pretty much decimated. There were a lot of organizations that were really dependent in a lot of ways on support from the federal government, and with the admissions numbers just dropped dramatically, there were a lot of organizations that had to shut down. And there were a lot of people who were working in the resettlement space, and that were working in building partnerships with higher ed institutions and other institutions working in the quasi-resettlement space, that suddenly found themselves out of work because their agencies weren't being funded. And I think that there was an important jolt of optimism when the current administration came in and said, look, we're going to raise the refugee resettlement numbers back up to 125,000 people. And that, I think, really helped to galvanize a lot of the activity among the NGOs, the educational institutions, the others who've been involved in this space. And then of course August hit, and the sort of question of resettlement and engagement with the thousands of people that were being brought in from Afghanistan. And a lot of higher ed institutions have been involved with trying to look at educational access and resettlement and other pieces. So there's been a lot of activity. Some of it, I think, has been triggered by some of the signaling, and some of it's also been triggered by just sort of a different set of realities. And in a number of the conversations around the initiatives, or the initiative, depending on how we want to read the title, there have been a number of people from state, there have been a number of people from the administration who've taken a very, very active role. And it's been actually very encouraging to see sort of the level of support. Now, how that gets manifested over the next bit of time, we'll see. But I think that there's a different level of energy that's there right now.
Absolutely. Good point. Absolutely. Thank you. I just want to do a quick check-in given tonight's events. It's 6:38. How are we feeling about continuing with the Q&A? Feeling okay?
One or two more questions?
If you all feel like you need to leave at any point, just let me know. Thank you all for your understanding on tonight's events. Our next question we'll take from the chat. We have a question from Molly McSweeney. It's great to see your name pop up, Molly. In light of the financial constraints due to the COVID-19 pandemic on universities, what messages can we share to university administrations that still may be open to building these pathways for students from refugee backgrounds? It's a very relevant question.
As someone who's stepping into a presidency of a university, so part of the reality is that all universities are scrambling under the financial and the health related and the other realities of the past 2 years, and there are many institutions that were caught off guard, that are wrestling with questions around how to keep their doors open. Luckily, not as many have shut down as I think many people anticipated a year ago. But that does add a layer of complexity, because a university 2 years ago that would have said, yeah, we think we can identify some of the resources. We think we have some of the alumni who can tap into to help to support some of these scholarships. Presidents of such universities are really stretched. So I think that the one of the biggest things, and this is also where I think work such as that of No Lost Generation and other student efforts is really important, is just sort of keep this issue on the radar. Because administrators and universities are wrestling with dozens of other questions. So, so as much as the students and the alumni and other constituents can say, we recognize all of the challenges around keeping universities running, but we want to remind you this is an important issue. And we'll keep coming back to the table on this next year or in 2 years when the financial situation is a little bit better, and we'll keep advocating. So recognize the challenges, but also keep pressing for initiatives such as this.
Yeah. Another point I would mention in kind of messaging, I'm glad that Kyle took this question first, because he is what we're talking about. But I would also consider emphasizing that this is not all on universities, that there are philanthropic institutions and donors that are very interested in this issue, and that will want to support these efforts as they get built up. So it's not the financial. It's not only on the institutions of higher ed to come up with funding for this, that can be kind of a cost sharing. And I would also just kind of from maybe tapping into the desire for universities to lead, emphasizing that right now the U.S. and U.S. institutions of higher ed have a real opportunity to be leaders in this space, and there are conversations like this happening around the world right now. The U.S. isn't, I have colleagues in a number of other countries who are specifically focused on working with the higher ed community in those countries on creating more opportunities for refugees to be able to go and study in those countries. And everybody is looking at the U.S. We have the largest system of colleges and universities in the world, some of the wealthiest institutions in the world. This is the moment for us, the U.S. higher ed community, to step up and lead, and others are watching. I mean, on calls that I am on with global calls with people from around the world, I feel like, and I don't think it's just in my head, there's intense interest in the U.S. and in the U.S. higher ed community in particular around this issue. And so anything that can be, mentioning that to leaders, that you have a chance to really lead on this issue and be noticed by people around the world could also help.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think, yeah, I want to just highlight again, as you mentioned earlier, Columbia University has a scholarship already for displacement background students. They have 30-ish students every year who receive full tuition, housing, living expenses. So they're leading us, in my opinion, as well as Salve Regina, Wheaton College, UC Irvine, and then Canada really is my example. So it's fantastic to see we have leaders to look to, and I really believe that GW can enter that space of being a leader. So thank you for coming back to that. I'd like to maybe have this be our last round of questions and fit 3 questions into one. So if we can keep those in our head, maybe we can do over here, Jessica, if you have your question in the plaid jacket here, and then in the back as well. We can just do boom, 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 and then answer whatever it feels like is, we have capacity for.
Thank you so much for being here. It's been really insightful, everything that you shared. So given the fact that the rhetoric often takes a deficit lens when talking about refugees, how can we, or the administration or higher education institutions, change that rhetoric to more of this untapped human potential side of things? What kind of initiatives can they take, or what leadership opportunities do they have to change that rhetoric?
Can you do up here?
So my question is, so far we've been talking about granting refugees access to the brick and mortar and physical institutions, but what about other revolutionizing tools, especially with increased online learning? So if we can't bring refugees to the classroom, what about bringing the classroom to refugees? I know that there's like the University of People, which is an online, free, American accredited university that focuses on open access to higher education globally. Do you know of any other initiatives?
Thank you. Fantastic. And Arthur?
I was just going to ask, how best do you think that we, the people in the audience who want to enact change, how best do you recommend us to do so, whether that be, calling elected officials or donating out of pocket to local organizations? Just your opinions on that.
Thank you. Those were fantastic questions. That was a lot. Do you feel like we remember?
I have a response to your question, and then I'll ruminate on the others. Great question. There are a number of U.S. Institutions and institutions globally that are, in fact, working in this space of connected learning and kind of delivering higher ed opportunities via virtually. University of the People is one. There's a consortium that's US-based called the Connected Learning and Crisis Consortium, CLCC. I believe it's hosted by Arizona State University, perhaps co-hosted with another institution. But so Arizona State University, Southern New Hampshire University, and there are a number of others, but those two are kind of, in my view, seen as leaders in this space in the U.S. But I believe the consortium itself is also has organizations from around the world, and there's a pretty vibrant ecosystem with a lot happening there as well. So great question.
Thank you.
Did you want to take one?
Yeah, if I remember. Yeah, but I think one of the questions is how can the audience best help in these initiatives? Again, it kind of goes back to what we've talked already about, that we all have the power to, to influence the policies that do happen. And that can be either by your representative, kind of let them accept why, let them advocate why it's important to welcome refugees. And then also if they are platforms or refugees organization that you know you can volunteer, be part of it. An example of welcoming initiative like on campus, something that you can join hands and let's push all the, like a GW administration to really join hands and do at least something that Columbia University is doing, because that will be like, an added advantage to refugees. Can also be other NGOs that are providing online learning to refugees. So there are a lot of things that you can do as an individual. All it takes is for you to have that interest and then go out there and find there's so much on the internet, and you'll be able to contribute.
My response is going to be pretty simple. It's going to just make it happen. On the rhetoric question, yeah, there's a really negative and nasty rhetoric that's out there. Not only about refugees, but of migrants and people who may not be from here, and create a different narrative. Work with people and tell the stories, introduce people who are from different backgrounds. When you're in a position, and actually you are right now as a student here, to create some pipelines and work with others to create pipelines so that the demographics in a classroom can change and can include people who might have a refugee background. Can sit in that classroom with you and others, figure out some ways to make it. There's a scholarship opportunity that we've heard a bit about tonight. So there are ways to get involved. And the same thing in terms of the question back there, in terms of, what can you do? Maybe you can give, maybe you can write a letter if you have an elected official who's in office who's a bit of an idiot and takes sort of the position that, that's really counter to a lot of this stuff. Maybe you can mobilize people and vote the person out. So there's a lot that can happen. And I would say, continue to stay involved. Don't let this experience that you're having. Are you an undergraduate or a graduate student here? Okay, so you're a freshman. All right. So, I started off my comments by saying, it was around this time in the fall of '88 that I was a freshman in Thurston Hall, and I went and interviewed for a refugee organization. And that interest in remaining involved with these issues has been a lifelong interest. As a student, as a faculty member, as administrator, as a donor to this institution and others, as a voter, as someone who works with Olivia and other students in other places, it's just something that I carried throughout my life. And this is something that you're energized by now. Find ways to sort of stay involved and just continue to do something.
I might just add, echoing what both my colleagues mentioned, that it is really, you might not realize this being on this campus, but it is unique and fabulous that you have kind of No Lost Generation exists and is active and really working on this issue. I don't think if I was speaking at any other campus in the US, it would be a little bit of a more difficult response to specifically how you can support refugee access to higher education. But the fact that there are colleagues of yours already working on this, and maybe you're already involved, get involved on the efforts that are happening on your campus, and others will notice, other campuses will notice. The Columbia Scholarship was created not by student pressure, it was more of a top-down kind of thing. If there's a scholarship that gets created because students have pushed for it and made it happen, other campuses and other students will take note, and that will be something to point to, that organizations and other campuses and other student groups wanting to do something similar will be able to point to and say, GW did it, we can do it too. So not only will the impact be on GW, but it can be much greater than that as well, what you do here.
Olivia mentioned the Canadian model a few moments ago. For those who aren't familiar with the sort of Canadian model, a number of students in some universities in Canada basically said a few years ago, we realized that there's this huge issue around refugee higher education access. We want to do something. So they said, well, you know what, why don't we see if we can put a referendum on the books to vote to do a minor student fee increase. So they voted and it passed. And there's it's not much, I think it's maybe like $1 or so a semester that goes into this scholarship pool that provides support for refugee students. And that's a model that folks around the world look to.
Yeah.
Student-driven model. I mean, they came up with something and they did it. So make stuff happen.
Absolutely. And yes, all of your words have warmed my heart so much. So thank you for all of those thoughts. Along the lines of the World University Service of Canada Scholarship, if we as GW students increased our student fee by $6 and I believe 74 or 78 cents, we could fully sponsor a refugee student, not only their tuition, but also their housing, books, flight here, the whole thing. We have a whole funding breakdown
Every year.
in our scholarship.
New student every year.
Everything.
That's huge.
It's not that much. So please do check out our scholarship proposal. We're asking for signatures. So if you want to sign on, there's a quick Google form. We're asking students, faculty, staff, even alumni, student organizations to sign that scholarship proposal. And we have a committee as well that works on it. Thank you to, you can see all around our committee members working this event. So huge thank you to our Welcoming Campus Initiative Committee. We meet every other Saturday at 2 p.m. to talk about how to get the word out about the program, how to host events like these, how to promote that initiative. If you'd like to join us, we also have, as No Lost Generation, we have meetings every Sunday at 4 p.m. in person and on Zoom. You can find all that information and more on page 8 of our packet, as well as more information on each of the organizations represented here tonight, as well as President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. I highly recommend, if you're interested in getting involved or donating, volunteering, each of those websites has information on how to do so. We have a gala actually on December 3rd to benefit Elumisha Kakuma with DING. So if you're interested in supporting that while also enjoying some nice performances, a dinner, we have an outdoor area to eat, COVID safe, safety-wise, and big ticket raffle items. So that's December 3rd at 7 p.m. in the Elliott School City View Room. There's an RSVP on page 8 or 9 of the packet. As well, looking towards other No Lost Generation events, we have this Friday at 3 p.m. We're co-sponsoring an event led by Sarah Asaf. I see her in the back. 3 p.m., same place. We're having a conversation titled The Dimensions of the Humanitarian Crisis in Yemen, a conversation with Foreign Minister Khalid Al-Yamani. This will be a fantastic opportunity to learn more about that conflict and ask questions to someone who has had a vested interest in that area. We also have an upcoming panel discussion on Thursday, November 18th at 6 p.m. Titled Forced to Home, Gender, Violence, and Migration in Latin America. We'd love for you to join us for that as well. So again, page 8 of that packet has more information to RSVP. Thank you so much to all of our panelists here, to the Welcoming Campus Initiative Committee and the whole No Lost Generation team who made this happen tonight, and to all of you for joining us. Again, our partners are listed on the board, and you can find more information in our packet. I just want to say this has been more than I even dreamed of, so thank you so much for speaking with us today, and thank you to those joining us virtually. Feel free to join us upstairs. We have dinner, it's free, and you're welcome to walk around. So it's the second floor. If you just go up these stairs, there's also an elevator. There's like an art gallery area that will have food set up. And then just one last announcement. We had Dr. Miriam Feldblum was here today, and I know she might have a relative in the audience. So if that is you, please come find me. I'll be at the end of the stage over there. But huge thank you again to our panelists, our partners, and to everyone joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.